I'm not really sure because that way of interpreting the way the Iowa gambling test works is a bit sounds very behaviorist or oriented towards that type of learning, where
Yeah,
it's more like responses, a stimulus response sort of thing, which
right.
it's not invalid, but it doesn't seem like it's a great explanation for this type of task. It can only tell, I would say, as a psychologist, that it only tells part of the story. I
Mhm.
mean, a stress response, I mean, that does help you teach things. It's a motivator in a sense, and it can affect your dopamine release. But as far as pattern matching, I don't think that's a good enough explanation. I don't think it's enough to say that a stress response can produce this sort of pattern matching within, like, it requires something more cognitive, something more mental than stress.
Well, is that what they're saying? Let me just I thought they were saying that we pick up. I don't know, they were going into the details because I didn't read the actual study, but I didn't know. I thought they were saying we somehow magically automatically pick up on the pattern. Let me just title this one.
It
I'll add
it
something
depends a
else.
lot on the theory and the perspective they're coming from. That sounds
Okay.
very behaviorist oriented.
Right. Oh, okay, I see. So there's different. You're saying there's obviously an experiment done, and you could read it. There's
Yeah,
different days ways to interpret that data.
yeah.
Yeah.
There are
Okay.
more cognitive answers to that sort of question. Like, I mean, that is more cognitive psychologist. What I like, I think more about what's actually the computation. What's the inference going on here? And behaviorism is more to do with like
Still listening.
it's more
Sorry.
surface level. It's more surface level.
So,
Like
uh, why would the cognitive interpretation, wouldn't that be just as determinist? Like, because cognitive to me is brain. I think of the brain.
I mean, cognitive can include volitional processes. I think it's just cognitive being that there's mental states involved.
Okay,
There's like figuring out and
okay,
directing of attention rather than. I mean, this is more passive. That explanation is more passive. Like
got
the
it.
data goes in, gets interpreted, and out pops the statistical response or whatever. I mean, statistics are fine, but it's not really going through like what's the mind doing here.
Got it. Okay. I mean, so you're saying obviously there are results in here, but you're saying that the interpretation might be incorrect to say like unconscious learning. Um,
Yeah, we
got
can
it.
refer to like neurons altering their firing patterns, and that would be legitimate, but it's more theoretical here to say then there's unconscious learning. We would have to say, well, should you call that learning? Does this tell the whole story?
Yeah.
Is Are we really capturing what's going on? Like you get the full, like different people would think this is a full story, but I don't think it is.
Got it. That makes sense to me. Well, here is the section that because the rest of it is kind of actually some of this is, oh well, that's the zone, that's not fully related, but he does there's some really interesting distinctions that he made. Oh, maybe I didn't copy them. Let's see. um, he tried to make all these distinctions between hunches and intuition, and oh, there we go, I didn't copy it. Okay, I got it. But to get into this, we probably need to have a quick look at the text on the study. So, he makes all these distinctions between thinking, instinct, and intuition. And so this is his analysis of the study.
Who's this
And he's
guy?
actually, so he's a psychologist, but he specializes in poker. And so he mentors players, and he wrote a book about the mental game of poker, but he also coaches golf. So you could call him like a mental game coach slash therapist. But a lot of his work is based on research and performance psychology and that kind of thing. Um, so he's saying it centers around what he calls unconscious learning, which I'm assuming is what they called it in the study. Um, okay, so let me just see if we can find something. He's saying the proof comes from an interesting study called the Iowa gambling task, role of emotion. Okay, so the actual study is they were given $2,000. There were 4 decks of cards in front of them face down, and each deck had its own expected value. So like, the good deck was a $50 win and a $10 loss. Bad deck was a $100 win and an $80 loss.
Yep.
I mean, I'm not too sure of, I guess they would have just noticed there's 100 on this. And then after a while, somehow they keep track of where they're losing money. I don't really know. But he's saying that, or the study's saying they measured their anticipatory SCR levels, whatever the hell that is, which is a measure. Do you know what an SCR is?
S. Let me see the
Anticipatory
context.
SCR level.
S.
I don't know. I'll look it up. I don't know what it is. So
Anticipatory SR level. Yeah, I don't recognize that term.
skin conductive response.
Oh, like they put like electrodes on your skin
Must
to
be.
see
Yeah.
how much like different signals sent through the skin.
Yeah, I just found a study sweating the small stuff, a meta-analysis of skin conductance on the Iowa gambling task. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
When stressed, the body secretes micro amount of sweat through the fingertips. This is what researchers used to identify when the body was experiencing stress, even when participants weren't feeling it consciously. That's what's interesting. The research showed that on average, participants began showing greater stress reaction when reaching for a bad deck after selecting only 10 cards. So that is the 100 to minus 80. Like basically your wins 100, your losses are $80. Curious if this stress reaction was registered consciously, research asked participants if they had developed a strategy to maximize profit. The participants had no idea the body's begun to recognize the difference between the 4 decks. So they only had this anticipatory increase in the anticipatory stress response when they reached for the 100 to negative $80 deck. So random cards were randomly set up as 100 or negative 80. Oh, well, I guess they're not just 100, they're just higher value. So they started getting a stress response which they were unconscious of after 10 cards, but consciously they didn't know, they didn't recognize it. So that's super interesting.
Yeah.
As they continued picking up cards, the gap between the anticipatory SCR for good and bad decks widened. So there's more of a response on the bad deck. Okay, it continued throughout the study, which consisted of 90 more card selection. However, something changed around the 50th card selection. At that point, the researchers asked if they found a way to maximize a profit. But okay, so at this point, after 50 cards, they report having a feeling or a hunch. So at card 10, it's like the body, at least according to this study, at card 10, their body's picked up. It has an increased stress response on the worst decks. Okay, and then his interpretation is it was as though the knowledge of how to beat the game was on the tip of their tongue at the 50th card selection. Finally, around the 80th card selection, the light bulb turned on. They could explain the differences between good and bad. So what started as unconscious differences in stress reactions grew into a hunch. So he's making a distinction between stress reaction, hunch, and then conscious recognition. And then they've got so they've even distributed it into pre-punishment. So you can see there's not much of a difference. Good anticipatory SCR level difference. And then you get to, like it starts widening out. And then once it's hunch is this area here, once you get to conceptual, obviously they're a bigger difference. He's saying it proves there is constant data collection and pattern recognition happening below the level of our awareness. I guess on a perceptual level, we agree with that, right?
Perceptual level, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I would clarify here that I don't think that interpretation is invalid. I don't think it's invalid to say that there's something unconscious or something you're not aware of going on.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's clear that the body is responding in some statistical manner to these responses. But I mean, that, as I'm saying, though, that's only part of the story. Yeah, it's
Right.
true. Your body is taking notice in some way, that your neurons are probably encoding it in some way. It's not just arbitrary. It's a response to the world in a direct way. But then we have to go on to say, well, what else is going on in this scenario? What would it mean to say that you've learned one pile is better than the other? In a way, we can say that for it to be learned and understood, you do have to bring in some more cognitive aspects into it. You have to explicitly recognize what's happening. You have to be able to apply it to other patterns, and we have to think about if they act on the pattern, what are they doing to actually notice it? I mean, true, like their body is having a response, but what you do to demonstrate your learning, what would it say to respond successfully to that? Like, are you going to actually be able to respond in a way that demonstrates that you can take advantage of noticing, or that your body just say notices something happened? What doesn't mean you're going to do anything about it, or even realize, or even act in a way that would make you react better. What we want is to be able to respond to this new information. What can your body do? What can you do to then respond in a way that you pick the right stack more often? What can you do to be more successful in the task rather than simply responding to it?
What's your take on how do you how I can't think of how is the body reacting first before there's even a hunch? Like that's what I'm
Well,
confused by in this. Because yeah, it's like this is a conceptual thing. You're talking about numbers, you're talking about some cards you win more, some you win less. Like how is it's weird that the body is responding
yeah,
first.
it's complicated to explain. It has to do with the neurons responding to a stimuli and the frequency that they respond, or the frequency which with maybe your eyes may respond, or something in your body. It can tune itself to the context. It can tune itself to, like, as the environment changes, the neurons can fire differently. And the frequency of firing, which, I mean, it is very mysterious how it works that the body can respond to the frequency of firing, for instance. But then that can release dopamine a certain way, and that can activate a memory, or even like a memory you're not quite aware of. But the sort of thing that goes on when you learn to, I don't know, ride a bike. Your neurons have to fire a particular way to help your muscles respond correctly in exactly the right way. It's kind of like that. Like when you put it in the same situation a lot, it tends to fire the same way again.
Although I can understand that, like, let's say in the case of riding a bike or coordinating muscle movement, but in this case, we're speaking of the decks. So each card in the deck is assigned a dollar value, and that, is positive or a minus. And somehow your body is like, it's not that your body's tallying up numbers. That doesn't make sense. That's what because it has to hit you through your concepts first. Like dollar values are conceptual, right? A win or loss is conceptual in dollar terms. So it's so weird to me that this information, like the good decks, here we go, lower value of 50 to minus 10. These are just examples, or 100 to minus 80 was the bad deck. That has to go through your conceptual faculty first. And yet, according to this study, it's the bodies that is responding and identifying the bad deck first. That's what I find strange. Do you know what I'm saying? Because you're talking about bicycle riding and neurons firing, and that I understand. In this, I don't. I don't get why the body is responding first to something that is conceptual.
So there's a few ways to interpret that, I think. One could be that it's a bottom up and top down process going on here. Top down being there's a stress response. You're stressed when you lose. When you see something negative happen, you create a stress response just in that way alone, just emotionally and almost conceptually. You could say you're judging good and bad, but then once you go that way, then your body can just respond to the stress itself. Like every time you feel a stress, it fires. Whether or not you know why you're stressed is just correlating with it.
Okay, so they didn't pick up on the fact that they were stressed. They weren't conscious of anything. So do you think it's I don't know, maybe there is like a pre-emotion. You just have to notice your body responding. Your body can respond to conceptual identifications, but on a very subtle level, maybe.
Yeah, I mean the way top down works can be interesting. It is interesting how could concepts go down to affect the perceptual level that you're not even in control of. It could have to do with, well, like this kind of thing, like just if you have some kind of response, your neurons will fire in some way, and it could be just the repeated firing in the same way. It'll start to create, the neurons will create their own patterns. They'll fire a certain way under one condition, a different way in another condition, and that gives your brain the ability, at least it gives you the information to say that there's two things going on. And it'll be a very complex process here because it to both consider how do the concepts affect maybe your response initially, like just say, oh, I don't like this, I don't like that I lost this hand or something, or you were disappointed, like you just, it wasn't what your goal was, like you got a negative response, like, oh, I didn't want that. You could just keep going through that. That could affect the way your body primes itself to respond. And then on the other hand, you go bottom up, like in terms of strictly like if something happens, your body encodes it even just as initial memory. Like you're gonna remember what happened, and sometimes what happened can include like stress or anything else. Just a memory is often just the same event happening again with given the context. It just keeps firing. So what ends up happening is that you could say you've learned a response. You could almost say you have the intuition developed over time because after repeated firing enough times, it's gonna maybe rise to a level of emotion or awareness that you can be aware of that
Yeah.
something's happening. You don't know why, but you know something's happening. So it's a complex process of your concepts and the stimulus you're responding to as well, rather than just the stimuli or just your concepts. It's usually a
So
bit of
you,
both.
I don't see what stimuli in this case would be because it's all conceptual stimulus. Like it's a win or a loss, good or bad deck, right? But
I mean,
I,
a stimulus even just you see you see one card versus another. I mean, one card is one stimulus, a different card is another. It doesn't really need to know the conceptual value of it, just that there's a difference. One's one card and one's another card. They just have a different look, and that would be sufficient to be different stimuli. But you'd be right. There's no information in the stimuli itself that
mm.
makes it say you should be afraid of it or you should be fearful or something like that. That's where your concepts could come into play. It can then
Well,
further modulate your response or further alter your response.
I wonder if there's like you could think of emotion as being on a continuum where on the lowest level when you pick up on something it's like it's on that SCR level where you're just getting some kind of skin conductive response or something like that. But then as you increasingly recognize more and more clues or evidence, you're you'll then feel the emotion as opposed to just have some very subtle response.
Yeah, I
But
think that
that's
actually fit in with some animal studies too. That I mean, clearly some animals they have a range in which they can respond to their world, and some are more complex than others. I mean, clearly a pigeon is much more intelligent than an ant. I mean, they both respond to the world and they both have neurons that fire,
yeah.
but we can say that there is a continuum of types of responses they could have. And that might be, for example, emotion or some other cognitive or some other mental content here that gets
Yeah.
more and more detailed, perhaps, or there's more information available.
Hmm. I was thinking maybe, so I'm very curious to know if someone replicated this. So what they did was they set up the worst deck had a lower expected value, obviously, but the cards were of higher value. For example, negative $80. These are just examples. They would have been in this range or something. And the better deck obviously had lower values. And I'm curious if you switch these decks around, meaning you actually set up a deck that was of higher value, but also had a positive expected value. And then you set up a deck of lower value that had a negative expected value, if these responses would switch. Because, like it does, in my mind, it would make sense that someone would feel a little bit more stressed when they start noticing one deck has higher payoffs or losses. Like just on that, without even knowing if it's a better deck, you might even respond in a bit more stressed. You know what I'm saying? There's more excitement. There's like, oh,
Yeah.
I can win $100 on this deck. And this deck, I keep winning like 50 or 30, like it's pretty shit. And then, oh, wow, I lost 80. Like it does sort of make sense to me that the stress response there would be higher on that alone, putting aside any recognition of the expected value. Thoughts on that? Too bad no one's replicated this in reverse the decks.
I feel like there's gotta be somebody who tried that, because it seems such a clear thing to try. It's
I couldn't
very
find
obvious I would
anything.
try that too. But
I've got to look it up.
yeah, I have some studies and related things about stress responses or actually decision making. This is really a decision making study.
I'm going to email the people who did it actually and ask them if someone reversed it.
Yeah, people, they usually respond. I mean, any professor usually responds.
Oh, cool. I did it so long ago though. I'll definitely go through the study and ask. So you reckon someone would have done the reverse?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, the responses should change in that expected way, or even that the positive responses should, they should reverse and maybe even strengthen. Like the difference would be even greater if you made it like good deck, big wins, or good deck with wins versus bad deck with bad losses. You might expect a bigger difference in the two.
Oh yeah, so you're talking about you're not talking about the absolute values anymore. You're just saying that a good deck would have a high positive value, like you increase the spread between the negative and positive. So like good deck will have higher positive,
Yes.
like bigger wins and smaller losses, and just experiment that way and see what that effect would have. Yeah, I mean that would be cool.
Yeah.
But then also definitely just switching around the high value deck being the good deck, and then the low value absolute value deck being the bad deck, and seeing what change that would have. I don't know if they did that because I couldn't find anything else. Do you reckon they should have done something like that if they were doing this whole study?
You probably could find like not the same study, but a similar study in probably like rat experiments. This is a very typical sort of thing you'll set up in rat or pigeon experiments, that you have a thing of some value and a thing of another value, at least in terms of their shown desire for, like, you could give a rat water and then, or a shot could be a negative value, and I don't know, you give them sugar and that's a positive value, and you can compare their responses that way. And I imagine you could get something out of that with animal studies. This is interesting because it creates a human context for similar types of studies.
Yeah, although one difference with rats, in this case, I do think this is conceptual, like wins on decks is a conceptual identification.
Yeah, so you would, of course, also want to compare, if you did a similar thing with a rat, you see how it might differ from humans. Like, do rats do something different in the way they develop their value response, or the way their stress response is, or even their selection of different things?
Yeah, I will definitely look up now that you mention it, see if I can find replications of this. Yeah. Okay, well, we can go to some of this now since we've discussed.
Yeah.
What do you think of
So
this learning model?
I think it's pretty good. I mean, is
Intangible
that,
competence?
oh, intangible competence? I didn't see what you were highlighting.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, this.
yeah, the zone model learning model is pretty good, but in, well, this might be different than what I'm thinking of. I mean, where did you get this one from?
Same book. Just writing
Do you
down.
know what scientist
Find
came
it.
up with this? Oh, it's the same guy.
I didn't get same guy, but I didn't get where he got it from.
He probably got the idea from Vygotsky, but he modified it here clearly, I think. Or at least it's something developed further. I mean,
Yeah,
Vygotsky was saying that like you have as like a zone of competence or something like that, where you have your current ability and then a range with that's beyond your ability. Like if you're learning chess, imagine like your zone is maybe just some simple games, but you're not going to be able to reach into the level of grandmasters beyond your zone of
right,
development. But you can harness the people outside your development zone to help you get to that level. It's a way, to, I mean, to learn different concepts or the way to develop because you're reaching out beyond your zone of development. So it's based on like building up your knowledge from others or from the world around you, but that you can just keep building up from others rather than it's just your something innate or anything like that. It's constructivism was what they call it, where you build up your knowledge from some base level on up, which is kind of pretty compatible with objectivism in the sense that we begin with percepts and just develop from there. You keep building on what you began and just keep building and building, reaching out and out further and further until you reach that higher zone.
but what about so it sounds like you're talking, it's almost like a hierarchy of competence, but in this case, he actually, there's one thing he calls intangible competence, which is you know what's right but can't explain why it's right.
Yeah.
Whereas I, and then but he makes a distinction between that and
Okay.
unconscious competence. Like, so there's level one, intangible, where you know somehow you know what's right but you can't explain it, and then level four is the knowledge is so well learned that it's automatic at all times. So they're almost
Okay.
like you know what's right first before you can conceptualize it, according to this model. So it
I
would
mean,
be
this
like
seems
an
to be
intuitive.
just,
Yeah.
yeah, uh, this seems to be just talking about the way you grow to understand something.
Okay. But then it would seem to be placing some kind of intuitive learning first. Like it's not,
Yeah,
yeah.
that would be an issue, I think.
Mm,
It does seem to be based on something intuitive and you're just building on the intuitions rather than something like provable or demonstrable or
right.
I mean different theories might just go you observe the world around you and that's about it. You know there's things in front of you and that's it. Which would be more like constructivist models like you begin with like you see some colored blocks and you don't have there's not knowledge there. It's just you gradually play with it and then might maybe develop goals with it that then lead you to search for more information. This is a different way of thinking. This is more like you have some intuitions, however, how whatever way they're formed, and then all you do is own those intuitions, either just to be more accurate, and then eventually reach a point where it's just automatized. I mean, there's an element of truth to this that like you can begin uncertain, then you gradually build up that understanding by learning from others and trying to gather more information, and then you reach a point where you can identify things explicitly, and then you keep using it, it becomes a habit. I mean, that way of thinking is fine, but as a learning theory, I don't think it's quite good enough.
Okay. It does also seem to me like there's two separate things. Like he's saying level one is this hunch or intuition. Level two is conceptual competence, which you can't consciously apply on a regular basis. They almost seem like uh, not level one and two, but alongside each other, like two different forms of learning, at least the
Yeah,
way he's described it.
yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
I agree.
Um, but he's saying you need constant access to new intangible competence because that's necessary to reach the zone. And then, okay, no, he is saying that this is level 1. So you somehow have an intuition or hunch, and then you
Yeah.
have to conceptualize it. That's what he's saying the process is for learning.
Yeah. But it's not wrong per se. I just think it's incomplete. Like, if it begins there, if all knowledge starts there, like, it's completely subjective there. I mean, I think you need to have some explanation in your model, whatever model somebody comes up with, like beginning or using perceptual information. He makes no mention of percepts or the first level concepts or anything like that, like referring to things that like blocks or dogs or keyboards or whatever it is.
Wouldn't he just argue that, or say, obviously he hasn't read Ito, but wouldn't he just say, like, you're saying it's subjective, but he's saying, no, it's not. The intuition gives you the direction, and then you validate it with your conceptual competence. That's what the point is. Wouldn't he just say that?
Probably, but I would just question, how do we know this intuition's even, like, what is the intuition? It seems
Okay.
a
Well,
bit vague here.
yeah, we'll
It's
get
not.
into, I'll see if I can find
What's his name, just so I could look him up?
Jared Tendler. Jared Tendler.
Tendler.
Yeah. He's quite switched on. So obviously not pokers, he coaches poker players and professional golfers. And like he's written quite a bit, specifically the application of psychology to those two fields. But
Mm-hmm. I don't. Well, he's not on Wikipedia.
no, he's not gonna. He just runs his own private practice or whatever.
Yeah, but I understand where he's coming from. I understand this perspective, but I don't think it's. I don't like it very much. It's too much based on these like intuitions, I think, which I see why somebody would theorize a lot about that, and it. But I think there's many issues with it.
Okay. So I mean, this is where he actually you asked what he means. Well, here is here are the distinctions he makes. So there are 3 types of knowledge accessed by your mind. So one is intuition, which talks about intangible competence of reacting in the moment. And there's thinking, conscious knowledge that requires effort to extract, and then instinct, knowledge trained to the level of unconscious competence. Now, there is there is something to this. I don't know, because in Musashi, even in Musashi, but like in other things too, there's a scene where he develops a new way of using swords. But the point is, he just randomly, unconsciously did it in battle, and only later did he come up with the principle to really refine it. But it was just sort of a in the moment idea that his subconscious threw at him, or he did without even noticing. But obviously he needed to think through it to make it a proper method and approach and really refine it. But that captures some of that too, where there's like some kind of something going on first, or something going on here. Like even Ayn Rand, right? She describes that she never she had a sense of life and she had a sense of what was right, but she went on later to validate it. So for her, there's something, I don't know what that is, but
I think these terms and definitions, I think they're fine enough. I don't have any real issue with it. The only issues I had is when he put it all together into a system. I don't think he's explaining the parts in the correct way.
Right.
I think he's right what the parts are.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think he's got a part of the story.
Yeah.
That's why I don't reject it entirely. It's just how you put it all together is what I disagree with him.
Okay. Well, how would you? We can go with these definitions. How would you? Do you see them as valid? I guess, but what do you think their interaction is? The intuition, thinking, instinct.
Instinct. I don't usually like that concept at all. I would usually just call it. Depends a lot what we're referring to.
Automated.
Well, I'll start up at the top. So intuition Or like just a feeling of knowing the answer. I mean, just in the most general sense, like it's a mental.
Or like, or not even knowing the answer, more like you have a feeling you need to react a certain way, or like going to that pilot example you use, something is wrong. It's like it's in the moment. You somehow your mind's taken information and done
Yeah.
something with it. That's how I interpret it anyway. Like, or like, let's say a poker player you're playing against someone and you feel like they're using his context. You just have a very strong feeling that they're bluffing and you don't know why, but you act on it. Like in the moment, you could say that's a sort of, not because it's not because you've seen anything in the past and you've automated a pattern of play, but it's more just in the moment, somehow you've got this very strong feeling. You could be wrong, but I think that's what he's referring to.
Yeah. I mean, in a way you could think of this as habits, um, just competent habits, habits you know that you've done a lot that work. You can say they're competent, but they're not quite. They're emotional or they're vague or they're um, yeah, they're feelings.
Are you talking about intuition or instinct? Because habits to me, I
Intuition.
think of instinct. Like,
Intuition.
oh, because when I think habits, I think what's automated is a habit. And so that's unconscious competence or instinct in his terms. So then what,
Yeah.
because intuition I thought was not habit. It was something new that you haven't seen. So it couldn't be habit.
Um, Let me rephrase it. Like, um, I was thinking habit in terms of um, some sort of pattern recognition. That's what I meant to more like your pattern recognition. You could just identify a new instance in a pattern. Usually, was what it involves.
So it's a process of deduction.
In a sense, I mean, it is true. It's not conscious. You don't direct it yourself. It kind of just happens. But I think I am right to say then, I think that it can't really be a habit because you're using new information here. I mean, you're using your intuition to pop up when there's new things happening. It's using old information or old pattern recognition to try to fit this new pattern into the old patterns.
Actually, I would argue that if we're talking about like, so just using the example of Musashi developing his two sword technique in like on the spot and then only later refining it, I would say so that you would agree that's sort of what he's referring to, that kind of creativity that just happens in the moment, right? Intuition. Um,
Yeah.
I would say that that's inductive, whereas what he calls instinct or automated habit is
Yeah.
deductive because you're like, this fits here, act this way, this fits here, act this
Yeah.
way. That's deductive, whereas this thing called intuition seems to be inductive, like you're literally coming up with something. You know, you're talking about a new instance of a pattern. So you somehow
Yeah.
reckon, yeah.
Yeah. I think that's the right interpretation. Um, intangible.
But then
It's
that would
thinking.
almost throw out, to me, it would seem to like throw out no, it wouldn't throw out thinking. It would just mean that you're almost limited by your intuition. Like your ability to be creative is almost limited by intuition, according to this interpretation. Because it's like suddenly there's your brain automatically does these things on some deep subconscious level where you don't have any control over it.
Sometimes I think so. Sometimes creativity is like that. I think there's ways to direct it beforehand and ways to make it happen more often
Mm.
as far as creative thoughts in for new situations and new things. There is an element of that. It's trying, well, it's complicated, but there's many steps involved in the creative process. Some of it is quite intuitive. It just pops up sometimes
Yeah.
without really deciding what will pop up. It just
Okay.
does.
Yeah.
Instinct, um, he's using in a different sense than most people. Just like saying that um, trained to the level of I guess he's just saying
Automated.
an even greater level of automation.
Yeah. Well,
I,
I didn't interpret intuition as automation. I interpreted it as
yeah.
like creativity in the moment or induction and this is
Yes.
automation.
Yeah. Instinct, he doesn't seem to be using it the way I expect. Almost like instinct in the terms of like you're in combat and all of a sudden you just act and just almost without thinking, you're moving your sword in any which way in exactly the right way every time, but you almost have no thought whatsoever when you're doing it. Like you've been
Right.
such trained in, to such a degree that it becomes an instinct. You're just not even thinking, and that's what it seems to be talking about.
Right.
Like if you're playing poker and you're really into it, you're in the zone. You're not even thinking, it's just all happening at once and almost so intuitive that it's like a magic state of being. Like
Yeah.
it just feels like
Cool. A magic state of being. I like that.
yeah. So I think that's what he's getting at.
But then the bottleneck, to me, it seems like the bottleneck is intuition then, because you don't control that. Whereas thinking you control, instinct you control through repetition, but intuition you don't. That would be non-volitional.
What do you mean bottleneck? I missed where you said
Bottleneck in
bottleneck.
like accomplishing things. Like if we're talking about getting good at something, then intuition, since it's just somehow that your brain does automatically, but you don't control it, that would be the bottleneck. Like what if you don't seem to have good intuition? Well, then it seems like you're screwed, even if you're a good thinker.
Yeah, but well, for that I would say that um, intuition ought to be. I think that. I mean, yeah, for what he's saying, I would agree with you, but I think in reality, what it is that intuition is affected by your concepts.
Right.
That it affects what the patterns there could be,
Right.
or an ability to recognize patterns. But I mean, that part, I would, if interpreting it that way, I would agree.
Right. Okay. Got it. Although it's strange because then you'd expect, well, it's not strange, but you'd expect someone who's like all the philosophers to be elite at everything and people who aren't philosophers not to be. You know what I'm saying? Like you'd have like a philosopher athlete, you'd have, because they'd all have the best concepts. So, but that, I don't see that. So.
Yeah, I mean, I'd almost wonder, what if you had a philosopher athlete? I don't know. I mean, but still, that makes a case for why you need to go out in the world and experience it and live it
Yeah.
and do it, because knowing is more than just those concepts. It's even what is grounded in perception, like what's there in front of you. I mean, it's not merely concepts only. There's more than like being a person, being a complete totality of a person than just your competence with knowledge. Like it has to be in the world and act in the world. Otherwise, it's not really anything.
Yeah. Oh, okay. This is actually in the context of decision making.
Yes.
Within the process of decision making, there are 3 types of knowledge. This is like, you know how Ayn Rand talks about cognitive abstractions, then I think normative.
Yes.
I wonder if this would be a normative abstraction, but not from a philosophical perspective, but still normative in the sense that he's saying a decision-making ability and tactical knowledge are separate, distinct skills. Decision-making is extracting that knowledge in order to make a correct decision. In the process of making a decision, you're evaluating a series of questions about the action, or let's just go with philosophy, about facts. Evaluating a series of questions. So it's like answering a quick bunch of questions is decision making. Would you say that's the same in philosophy, like morality and what are they called? Ethical, evaluative? I forget. Cognitive and um,
Well, I usually use descriptive and normative is the term is usually used.
normative abstractions. Yeah. Would you say it's the same thing? Like a normative abstraction is a series of questions or something that you answer rapidly when you're making a decision?
Not phrased that way. I mean, series of questions with a point to it. Like it answers some question that, like, what is it? Like, what's the point? What's the objective? What's the goal? Like, if the goal is understanding first that what are decisions for? You could say it's to act competently in the world. So any proper intuition or proper thought, or if you're using it in the right way, it will accomplish that goal. It will get to that end.
What, can you repeat that? Sorry, I didn't follow.
Like normative is what it would be for something to operate efficiently or correctly.
Okay.
But you have to know its goal, of course.
Yeah.
You could say if the goal of decision making is competent action in the environment, then you have to just as something that would be effective in that um, an intuition in a normative sense would be intuitions or feelings that accomplish that goal or reach that end eventually. And they could say it's normative. You're more than just describing what's happening. You're saying it has some end in mind or that there's some purpose to these actions.
Okay. If we're talking about normative abstractions and then being evaluative, like in a sense, so he's saying you make your decision and you evaluate a series of questions about actions. We can just substitute in facts for actions. You evaluate a series of questions about facts. If I've got like, when we're talking about, for example, metaphysical value judgments, in a sense, haven't I evaluated a series of questions about facts, about reality? Like, what kind of universe is this? Oh, it's an incomprehensible universe, or whatever you want to put it in, whatever terms you want to put it in. And then that forms a base layer for you then to answer the questions. In this situation, what do I do? Okay, well, it's an incomprehensible universe, and this person is doing this. Therefore, I should. Is that sort of how you think it might work? Because you've evaluated answers to big questions, and now there's just within that context, there are a few new questions that you have to answer on the basis of normative abstractions? Are they answers to are they like are normative abstractions metaphysical value judgments? I'm confused about the relationship between those.
Yeah, I would say they're normative judgments. You're making a judgment about the world.
But is it good for me or bad for me, basically?
Yeah, that's the kind of question. Or some question like, is it good or bad? Is it important or is it not? Like whatever goal in mind you have here. So it's normative in could say in the moral sense, it's normative.
Oh, okay. So normative can be dependent on just the purpose as well.
Yeah, I mean, you could talk about, I don't like, I'm trying to think of other examples of normative. Like in one sense in social science could be, like sociology could talk about the nature of, say, the prison system in the US. I mean, that's not making a judgment, it's just saying, this is what the facts are, this is how it works.
Yeah.
But then you can make a further judgment about that. Like, it ought not to operate that way. So we could have these reforms, or it ought to operate in this way. So we could have, here are some new concepts. Yeah.
So that's usually when it's in relation to someone, or so, like when you start thinking in terms of value, good, bad. I don't. It's not 100% clear, but I sort of get that. That's once you start thinking of it in relation to someone, then that's when it becomes normative. Is it good or bad for someone?
Whether it's to you, to someone else, or to some other relationship like that.
Right. Oh, okay.
Or there's a goal in mind. Like if you think the goal of sociology is to, like the reason you study it is to improve the world, then yeah, like you should make normative judgments based on the facts you've learned. Like about the prison, like if the prison system is this way and our objective in society is this, then we should modify the prison system in this way.
Right. Okay. Out of curiosity, this is a side tangent. Do you clearly see the way deep metaphysical value judgments affect every day? Because I don't. I'm interested, but when I walk around, I'm not like, oh, well, I'm acting on an incomprehensible universe premise. Now I'm acting on I just don't clearly see the connection. Do you?
It's not always clear. I can do it when, well, I'm making characters for stories. I don't really see it out there, but when I write characters, I tend to do that. It's the way I can think about, or at least handle what the character is to start. Like I could think, are they, like, what's their personality? That's usually how I start. Something kind of like, what do they feel about the world? Like, do they think the world is terrible and they hate living in it? And sometimes I could build on that and create a character. I can then create ideas like, if they think the world is bad, maybe they think they can know things, but it doesn't matter what they know because they have no control on anything. I mean, that can create a certain outlook in a certain person, and then I can get conflicts out of that and go from there.
Do you think they're reducible to like certain basic categories as far as the metaphysical value judgments of your characters?
There's ones I tend to use. I don't know if I'd say those are the categories there are, but I often have a skeptic of some kind, or a pessimist, or not a pessimist, a cynic. It's more like it. I have that a lot. And sometimes a character that's just depressed just because he doesn't care, almost like a nihilist. And those are sort of things and a character maybe that is as always idealistic and tries hard, but has some uncertainty within themselves.
Okay.
Like those are sort of characters I have.
What would be the metaphysical value judgments of a cynic on a basic, like categorical level of like, in terms of like knowledge or nature of the universe?
Nature of the universe. Actually, I'm not quite sure. For a cynic, I mean, more like, because cynicism is more than just the belief that things don't end up well. It's thinking that people are not even willing to do good things. They're not even wanting to. It's almost like, maybe it's something like people are unknowable. Not only are they unknowable, but that's harder. I don't know.
That would sound like what you described. Remember you were telling me about Kafka, and like it's almost like his universe is one of the arbitrary of like social metaphysics. Did you tell me that, or was that?
Yeah, that was me.
That would be more Kafka. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, more like that. I would say just that you're a cynic because you think people only operate on these social desires, and that's what makes people like bad or something, or that's why people act the way they do. It's never about the right thing. It's just about these narrow self-interested things, and we can never really know what people want because it's just shifting on the moment.
Do you one sec, I'll just